This presentation is going to focus just specifically on the process of getting a quote from an interview to use in your story, and also when to quote versus when to just paraphrase and or give attribution for information gathered from an interview. So it's quotations and attributions. So there's different types of quotations. They can be either just complete direct quotations, they can just be partial quotations, or as we said earlier, paraphrased or indirect quotations. We'll focus on each of the three. When are you going to use a direct quote? Well, if a quote that you get from an interview is really, really, really strong, very articulate, very memorable, very powerful, and it's just the type of thing when you hear it, and you'll usually know it, you're like, wow, this is something I want to pass on unfiltered right to my readers or to my viewers, right? It's part of the story that you want to have coming right from the source. That's a direct quote. So if it's something where you can't really paraphrase it any better as the writer or the author of the article, it's just at its best when it comes right from the origination point, that's when you want to use a direct quote. So usually it's something that's very emotional, very powerful. It's just something that you cannot communicate better in your own words because the subject that you interviewed did a great job in emotionally expressing themselves, being very, very quick and to the point and articulate in what they were communicating. Or it's just a very, very powerful, impactful, and memorable quote. So if it isn't that, then you have another option, which is if it's not that articulate or not that powerful, then you can actually just paraphrase what they've told you as well. So the other thing to think about is if you're going to consider doing a direct quote, then if the subject that you're interviewing is really well known or really very credible in the organization that they represent, so say a CEO or an executive or a president of an organization, getting that person on the phone or getting an interview from them tells the reader that you really did your work and that you're going right up to the top. It's somebody who's credible. So usually you're going to want to make sure you get a quote or two from them because that really suggests that you've done your homework. Or if it's a celebrity or an athletic figure or somebody who's really well celebrated in our culture, people like to hear directly from the subject, right? So if the subject is well known in any of these large or local angles, then a direct quote is more likely to be appropriate. Just make sure that the quote that you use, whatever the case may be, that it is something that does add credibility to the story, or it's a unique angle to the story. Also, of course, if it's just quirky or captures the personality, or like I said, if it's emotional or highly opinionated, those are great quotes to do for you to use directly. Now, what to avoid? If somebody goes on and on and on, it's a rambling interview, then chances are pretty good you're not going to want to subject your readers to the same torture that you went through having to interview the person who rambles, right? So you're going to want to probably avoid quoting that rambling rant. Maybe you paraphrase or succinctly weave down or pull out all the junk and just find the one or two sentence substance from that large rant, right? Or if it's a quote that has too much technical lingo, you also can try to paraphrase that so it's a little more digestible and understandable by the readers or the viewers. When you do quote, whenever and however you quote, make sure you do so accurately. Basically, the rule is that if I should clarify this. If the organization you're working for has a policy, you have to follow that policy. So the practice will vary by publication. But occasionally you will get somebody that you quote who does not speak very articulately, their grammar is poor, in which case the reporters will try to clean up the quote so that their subjects don't look like idiots, basically, right? So you want to be careful about that and only do that when you feel it adds clarity and does not change the context or the meaning. When all else being equal, do not change the quote whatsoever. You will be vulnerable to being accused of misquoting somebody, even if your intent was good. So you want to be very, very careful and selective about when you do cleanups. And then when you do clean up a quote, it should be very, very minor, just to fix a grammatical error. Never do anything that interjects or inserts in inappropriate words or meaning into the context of the original quote. That's obviously not ethical to do so. The other rule is that if you're interviewing somebody in a public format, a press conference, a debate, what they say is public record. You can't alter it at that point. I mean, you should never alter it anyway, but I mean, if somebody says something, even if it's grammatically incorrect, you can't fix it at that point because they're basically saying something where multiple people are witnessing it. So you'd be very, very careful about that. You don't want to be the one person to alter a quote to clean it up just to make them, look like they're a little more articulate when everybody else witnessed the same thing. So why would you have cleaned it up and nobody else did? So again, be very, very, very careful. The rule that you should follow in almost all cases is just let the quote go verbatim, even if it's inaccurate or, not inaccurate, but even if the grammar is not great. But yes, there are times where people will clean up the quotes, but be careful. The compromise is the sick notation. This is to say that if somebody has somebody has said something grammatically incorrect, and you as the writer need to quote them verbatim, and and it kills you, but that you have to reprint it verbatim, but you want to sort of make a knowing notation to the readers that, hey, we're reprinting what this quote is, but we know that it's incorrect, or we know that this grammar is off, or that there's a word missing, or that they misused a word. Add the sick notation in parentheses, as you'll frequently see in reporting, and that suggests that you as the writer are passing on the known problem without altering it. Never, ever, ever, ever make up a quote. Bad, bad, bad. This will get you fired immediately. You'll lose all credibility. It's not fair. It's not ethical. Don't make up quotes. If the people you're interviewing don't say something, don't put words in their mouth. Don't add words to a quote. Remember, we talked about the cleanup situation. That's the only sort of asterisk or qualification to that, but that's only under extreme circumstances. Be really, really careful. And by the way, I didn't mention this earlier, but if you do clean up a quote, usually what people will do is they'll put in the sort of blocky brackets, such as we see right here, the changed words to let people know that that's the case. So maybe somebody said a sentence, but they left out a word. You could put the missing word in the brackets to imply that the editor has inserted that in. Most publications will shy away from obscenities. So what happens if you interview somebody and they ramble on or rant something that's not in a sort of quote-unquote family-friendly format? One, think about your readership. If you're writing for a church newsletter, probably not going to want to repeat the obscenities, right? If you're working for a more edgy publication, I don't know, something like Vice Media, I guess, or a place that might be, the readership might not take offense to it. There may be situations where that is not shied on. Obviously, for broadcast over-the-air media, you can't do expletives. You're not allowed to do that. You violate the FCC regulations. But for print media, more often than not, most normal traditional news publications will actually not use the obscenities. If it's part of a quote, maybe if the quote only makes sense and is sort of important in the context of the story. But to do it otherwise is gratuitous. Some might view it as vulgar. I mean, I'm not placing my own judgment on this. I'm just saying in the media industry, you want to be very careful about that. So yes, sometimes you're going to interview colorful people and they're going to use expletives to make their point, but you only want to pass that on to the readers if it is appropriate in the context of who your readership is or are, in certain types of publications, or if it is relevant to the story. And in some cases, not always, but sometimes they'll actually sort of suggest what the obscenity is, but then do these sort of dashes. So S or F. Gee, kids, can you guess what that stands for? Probably so. So that's one way to deal with it. What about attribution? So attribution is when you give credit to the person that you're interviewing for the quotes that they say or the information that they give you, according to so-and-so, right? Or here's a quote from somebody, and you put it in quotes, and then you say that they said it, right? As the example here, this is a quote that teacher said. So attribution is just simply giving credit where your quote originated from or where the information came from. Now, in traditional news reporting, there's a conservative stance that's taken that basically says you keep the quotation really straightforward. So you would basically say something like said, the teacher said, right? That's just matter of fact. It's not the teacher cried, the teacher exclaimed, the teacher screamed, the teacher said, right? There's not as much judgment or interpretation when you say that somebody said something. I'm not saying there's not a time and a place for more descriptive attributions, but the norm in traditional sort of non-feature style, right, writing is that you would keep it neutral. And that's because you as a journalist are really not supposed to insert your own opinions. It's all based on what you observe as more fact-based documentation as opposed to opinion or judgment. So verbs to avoid, you put your quote in, he cried, she emphasized, she contended. Those are loaded terms, and they may be descriptive, they may even be accurate from your perspective. But what if they're not? What if you viewed somebody as crying and they had just something in their eye? And so you put that, she cried, and she's like, what? I wasn't upset. What are you talking about? So you're interpreting what you view to be truth when in fact you're not just documenting matter-of-factly what was said. So I realize people would take issue with that, but that is what you would typically expect in traditional journalism. In attribution, there's different ways you can include that information. You can either do it before or after the quote. Here on this slide are some examples of what that would look like. It's not that one's right or wrong. You could argue it either way. It depends on the flow of the story that you're doing. AP style is super important with this industry. Both journalism and PR follow AP style. And really, there's no way to sugarcoat this. You just have to learn through repetition and through reading what AP style is. I'll tell you a little secret that I learned is if you are in question and you don't have your AP style book handy, and or you're not sure, you can always Google or go to, say, New York Times and look at in their search engine what they do there. And I've learned that that often will do me right. If you see something in AP style, since New York Times follows it, if you see that in an article there, it's probably pretty accurate. But AP style, when it comes to interviewing people, says that you should use middle initials. So if you're interviewing somebody, let's say it's a hard news story, a local crime story, right? And you've got subjects that you're interviewing or that are suspects or anyhow related to it. Normally you would see that middle initial in there. Now, the only exception to this, as far as what AP style recommends, is that if it's a super famous and well-known person, then chances are pretty good that people know that that person is who they are. And so the middle initial becomes irrelevant. For local people who are not well-known international figures or celebrities or athletes, the middle initial is there because you don't want to get them confused with other people who share their same name. So if I were to do a story about a local crime incident, and let's say the suspect was named Joe Smith, well, guess what? In the town that you're in, there's probably a lot of Joe Smiths. So if you say Joe Smith is accused of stealing, blah, 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 well, what about the poor, innocent Joe Smiths in the city? So the middle initial helps to distinguish from those individuals who's who. And it's just a way, it's not going to solve all problems, but it will help eliminate the likelihood of confusion. So again, if it's a very, very well-known person, that's a different matter. But in most stories, AP style suggests you put those middle initials there for that reason. All right, talking to sources. So many of the best stories will not originate from a press release. I cannot emphasize this enough. The really good stuff does not often come from a sort of spoon-fed press release. So you have to talk to people, you talk to sources. And by nurturing your sources, you're more likely to get closer to the truth over the long haul. The longer you work with somebody, the more likely they are to trust you. And you also can trust them that they're telling you what's true or not. One thing to be aware of in interviewing people is that there is a situation that you may encounter where people say, you know what, I kind of want to talk to you, but I don't want to be identified in your article. Maybe they're fearful of losing their job or having some sort of backlash against them. So they ask for anonymity, right? And so the sort of thing you should be aware of is that, if you are practicing good journalism and you promise somebody anonymity, you really should hold to that promise. It is considered absolutely unethical to reveal the name if you have promised anonymity. And this can be problematic because sometimes there are things that happen where even though you've promised it and in the moment intended that to be kept, something happens later where your organization is sued or you're asked very directly by organizations or entities to say who that was and give up the name. And it's considered unethical to do so. Now, when I say exceptions in this next slide, this is sort of getting into some legal areas. Number one is there are times, depending on where you are in the world. I mean, I'm coming from the U.S. here, but in the U.S. specifically, there are some situations where the government may try to subpoena you or your organization to reveal the identity of your source. If you've promised them anonymity, they don't care. They want to know who that source was, and they'll ask for it very strongly. Usually that will be if they view that the information that you are protecting, that the source has, is in some way jeopardizing the national security, or if it's essential to solving a crime. Those two situations can be interpreted differently and widely by others. So, it's definitely ripe for debate. Another situation that can get you in hot water is if the publication that you are at has a policy against anonymous sources. You need to be aware of what that is. Sometimes there's situations where reporters are questioned their own integrity, and they are fearful that maybe you've just made up the quotes. Well, you say it's an anonymous source. How do we know you didn't just make it up? Right? So you want to be careful in those situations because it subjects you to being scrutinized as if you're being even honest and up front. A compromise that we typically see in some, but not all publications, is that they will allow for anonymous sources only under the circumstances where you, as the reporter, agree to share with one other trusted colleague the name of the source. They also adhere to that vow of protecting the anonymous source, but they at least can sort of offer a secondary validation that that source actually exists. So a great example where we've seen some problems here is, and this is worth Googling, by the way, Josh Wolf, who at the time of this incident, around 2006 or so, was a really relatively young, probably college age, early day blogger, and did a lot of video footage of protests and things where there were things he caught on video that he used for his reporting, and he had the edited version, and then he had the raw, unedited video footage. And he was asked by the government to essentially turn over the full, raw, unedited video. And this guy was I'm going to be careful on how I word it. There was a debate about whether he was a journalist or a blogger, and to what degree he was held to the standard of turning stuff over or not. Anyway, he was held in jail for 226 days, almost a year, which at that time was the longest time any U.S.-based journalist was imprisoned for simply refusing to give up protected materials, or, in some cases, you might say protecting his sources, right? He didn't give that up. So he went to jail. Interesting stuff. Be aware that that can happen, and so just know what you're getting into. Be very cautious if you go down the path of doing anonymous sources. Do they have an axe to grind? Do they have an agenda? Are they telling the truth? Are they reliable? Are they sober? Do they actually, is there a chance they're just using gossip? You want to just be aware yourself that you're not being used in somebody asking you to repeat their stories, but not be held accountable for it. You are not supposed to be a tabloid. Obviously, in this day and age, there's a lot of questionable, quote-unquote, journalistic outlets, many of which are very shady and or don't have the best reputations, okay? But we are trying to instill in you an awareness, certainly, and practice of good journalism and being ethical in what you do, and following sort of the gold standard, if you will, the Murrow standard, I guess, of proper reporting in the traditional format. So verify the information provided from your sources. Don't just take what they say at face value. You want to make sure that what they're telling you is accurate. So double check. Don't become a tabloid or a gossip source. There are different sort of levels or ways you can look at the issue of anonymous sources. There's what's called on the record, which means that it's just straightforward. Somebody's talking to you. They know you're the media. They know, and you guys agree that everything is fair game to be quoted and or given with attribution. Then there's sort of these other ones that get a little bit more nuanced: background, deep background, off the record. And if you go on background, that's basically somebody talking to you, if they use that terminology, that says that they realize that they can be quoted, but they don't want their name associated with the quote. So you actually have the quote, but you don't say who they are. Deep background is basically somebody just giving you, information, and knowing that information can be used, but they absolutely don't want their name attached. They absolutely do not want to be quoted, but they want you to use or agree to let you use the information, right? And that's useful for you in some cases. And then there's the other extreme, which is off the record. That's basically saying you can't use my information, you can't use my quotes, you can't use my, my name. Why the hell am I talking to you then, right? I can't use any of this stuff, so the reality is there's sort of nuances and shades between these things, but this can get you in hot water. I mean, this is why a lot of publications basically say, no, do not use anonymous sources for these very reasons. They don't want room for confusion. They don't want to be subject to legal liability, and they don't want inaccurate or not credible reporting associated with a publication. All right, so some publications do not allow anonymous sources. Others require you disclose the information to your supervisor. It's hotly debated, this whole thing. Let's move on. That's it. All right, we're done. That's it. Thanks very much.